Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Today we're going to be discussing fiqh, and in particular we're going to be reading from part of a book. It's a very short book called al-Masail allati khalafa fiha zad al-Mustaqni Muntaha al-Iraadaat, meaning the issues where there's a difference between Zad al-Mustaqna and Muntaha al-Iraadaat by al-Sheikh Suleiman bin Atiyah al-Mazini al-Hanbali al-Ha'ili rahimahullah, and he died in the year 1363. Now, just to go back a little bit and explain why did the author write this book and why are we discussing it now, we can say that in the latter period of the Hanbali Mathab, so we're talking from the time of al-Imam al-Mardawi until the current time now, this is where the Madhab was finalized. And during this period, the two most important books that were written were al-Iqna by Imam al-Hajaawi and Muntaha al-Iraadaat by Ibn a-Najaar. Now, Imam al-Hajaawi, his full name was Musa bin Ahmed al-Hajaawi, and he was the Sheikh of the Hanbalis in Asham. He died in the year 968 Hijri. Whereas Ibn a-Najaar, whose full name was Taqiyuddin Muhammad bin Ahmed al-Futuhi, famously known as Ibn a-Najaar, he died in the year 972, and he was the Imam of the Hanbalis in Egypt. So these two great Imams were living more or less at the same time, and they both authored these books, al-Iqna by al-Hajaawi and Muntaha al-Iraadaat by Ibn a-Najaar. And these two books are kind of like, we can think of them as the two pillars of the later period of the Madhab. So anytime there's an agreement between al-Iqna and al-Muntaha, that's the Madhab. However, we do have the issue when they differ. So in cases where they differ, Shaykh al-Hanabila, Abdullah bin Aqil, rahimahullah, he mentioned that the position of al-Muntaha is superior generally. And this is what I've heard related from some of my shuyukh as well. However, we've been talking about al-Iqna by al-Hajaawi, but as we said in the title of the book we're reading today, it's mentioning Zad al-Mustaqna. So Zad al-Mustaqna is another book that al-Hajaawi wrote, but it's kind of like a shorter version of al-Iqna. It's an introductory book. It's very popular, especially in al-Khalij, in the Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula. And I mean, that's the importance, we said, why he wrote this book, because for a new student, if you are going to be serious about pursuing knowledge, seeking knowledge, then you need to know the difference between these two books, especially if you're starting with Zad al-Mustaqna. Now, in the book, we're going to be looking at the part that has to do with the issues of Ibaadaat, or acts of worship. And the author has mentioned 8 points where there's a difference of opinion between Zad. We'll just, to make it easier, we'll call it Zad al-Mustaqna Zad, and Muntaha al-Iraadaat al-Muntaha. So there are 8 points or issues in the first section that has to do with al-Ibaadaat between Azad and al-Muntaha, and we will go through them here. So the author, he always starts by mentioning the position of Azad and then the position of al-Muntaha. So regarding the nafila or non-obligatory prayer inside the Kaaba, al-Hajaawi said in the Zad that it's not valid unless one is behind one of its posts, meaning the posts of the Kaaba. But in al-Muntaha, Ibn a-Najaar said it's valid regardless. Second point has to do with the person who's praying by himself. In Azad, al-Hajaawi said the person who's praying by himself can intend to be a follower or an Imam during the prayer, and making that type of intention during the prayer is valid during the non-obligatory prayer. However, in al-Muntaha, Ibn a-Najaar said it's not valid in the fard or the nafil prayer. So it's not valid in the obligatory or non-obligatory prayer. Third point, al-Hajaawi mentioned in Azad, if one says the salam in the prayer before completing it and doing this out of forgetfulness, and then he says something like a few brief words in order to correct that, it does not invalidate the prayer. However, in al-Muntaha, it says that it invalidates the prayer regardless. The fourth issue has to do with the superiority of different mosques. So al-Hajaawi mentions in Azad that the masajid or mosques that have greater or larger congregations are superior to those that are the older mosques. However, in al-Muntaha, Ibn a-Najaar says the older ones are superior. The fifth issue has to do with the payment of zakat. So al-Hajaawi mentions in Azad that zakat is not to be paid to a mutallabi. However, in al-Muntaha, Ibn a-Najaar says it is. Sixth issue, it has to do with fasting. Al-Hajaawi mentioned that having dissolved gum, like in your mouth, is haram if one swallows one's saliva and it contains the juice of the gum. So we can understand otherwise it's not haram. However, in al-Muntaha, Ibn a-Najaar says it's haram regardless. Seventh issue. This has to do with the ihram during the Hajj. So al-Hajaawi mentions in Azad that foreplay is unlawful, meaning sexual foreplay, in the state of ihram. And if one engages in it and ejaculates, it does not invalidate the Hajj. However, one re-enters the state of ihram from outside of the sacred precinct. However, Ibn a-Najaar mentions in al-Muntaha that it's sufficient for him to make ihram in that same place, meaning he doesn't have to exit the sacred precinct because it didn't corrupt the Hajj. So now we've gone through 7 points and we're at the 8th point. And on this point, I don't want to say that one of these positions is more correct than the other, but I would just mention maybe the rule we have mentioned regarding, or we can say the guidance or advice from Shaykh al-Hanabala, Abdullah ibn Aqil, about the superiority of the positions in al-Muntaha. This could be a case where there's some debate on the issue. So the issue has to do with those people who are in Hajj and they are doing Hajj as a Qarin or Mufrid. So one of these two types of Hajj. So in the case of the Qarin or the Mufrid, for those who did not do the Umrah or did not do the Tawaf al-Qudum in the beginning, the arrival Tawaf, he's saying basically it doesn't matter. One does the Tawaf al-Ziyarah and that's sufficient. You only need to do Tawaf al-Ziyarah. However, Ibn al-Najaar mentions in al-Muntaha that the Mufrid and the Qarin, so these are the people doing these two kinds of Hajj. Those who didn't enter it, meaning Mecca, before, perform the Tawaf al-Qudum, and then they perform the Tawaf al-Ziyarah, meaning these are two separate Tawafs. However, if we look in some of the shuruh, like the most famous sharh by Sharh al-Mathab, Imam al-Buhuti, rahimahullah, he mentions in his Sharh of al-Muntaha that yes, what Ibn al-Najaar said is mentioned by al-Imam Ahmed Nas meaning as an explicit statement, and it's the position of the majority. However, al-Muwafiq meaning Ibn Qudama, Shaykh al-Islam meaning Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn Rajab, they all chose the position that Hajaawi mentioned, meaning that you only need to do the Tawaf al-Ziyarah. Ibn Qaid al-Najdi, he's mentioned the same thing al-Buhuti mentioned in his Hidayat al-Raghib. I would also add, it's interesting that in Dalil al-Talib by Mar'i al-Karmi, he mentions under the section on al-Umrah that the Tawaf al-Qudum is from the Sunan acts of the Umrah. And I'm mentioning this because there is a position, it's not necessarily the most correct position, but some scholars said in the points where there's a difference of opinion between al-Iqna and al-Muntaha, that one can refer to what Mar'i al-Karmi mentions in Dalil al-Talib. Like I said, that's not the most correct opinion, but I think the fact that he also mentions it as the Tawaf al-Qudum being a Sunnah act, it's also worth mentioning. But my advice to you is that whoever you are following in fiqh, meaning a real Hanbali scholar that you're following in fiqh, it's best just to find what they tell you as what they believe is the most correct opinion, because we're not at that level to maybe say which is the most correct opinion. I mean, of course, if you go with what Ibn al-Najaar says in al-Muntaha, I mean, you're covered anyways. But as we're talking about one of the acts of the Hajj, it's very important to make sure that you have everything covered. So please consult with a reliable scholar to get what is inshallah the most correct opinion. I think we can conclude there as far as what we're mentioning in the book. I also wanted to add one point of clarification. The 8 points that we've gone over that the author has mentioned, these are actually not the only 8 points of difference in the parts of the book on al-Ibaadaat or acts of worship, but these are the 8 points that we can say that the author identified where there's really some significant difference, or there could be a potential different outcome or ruling if you're following one of the two opinions. So just as an example, that there is a difference of opinion between al-Hajaawi and Ibn al-Najaar on some minor issues, and these are maybe mostly issues that are related to some Sunnah acts So, for example, I believe in al-Muntaha, ibn a-Najaar, he mentions that when someone makes the sujood tilawa, or the prostration for the recitation of a verse of prostration, that one raises one's hands when going into the sujood and when rising up after it. Whereas Hajaawi said that one does not raise the hands in either instance. So these are quite minor issues, and I mean that's just an example of something where it's only talking about something that's like a sunnah act. But the 8 acts that we have, or 8 issues that we've reviewed, these are really a bit more significant issues, and there is a potential different outcome or ruling if you follow one of the 2 positions. So that's just to summarize that the 8 points are not the only 8 points of difference in the section on the Ibaadaat, but they're 8 points of a significant difference. Maybe as a final point, I would just also add, with regard to translations of Zad al-Mustaqni. I said this is one of the most popular books, especially in al-Khalij, and it is in translation. I know of at least 2 versions of the translation. The version that I have a copy of is Sheikh MUSA FURBER'S translation, Hafidhullah. However, I did see that in his translation, although he has some good footnotes on these 8 points, he doesn't mention what we've mentioned here. So if you have his translation, please listen to this video and make note of this, and inshallah I'll try to put in the description maybe some of the page numbers so you can also refer if you have that copy. Although regarding that copy, I heard from Sheikh Musa Ferber that he received some feedback on that translation, and maybe there were some comments on the accuracy of the translation, but it seems he's now decided to take that book out of print until further notice. I haven't studied the book that closely to know, what the errors are, and he didn't share with me specifically what they are. But I mean, what I've read, it looked pretty good. And that said, the only other edition that I'm familiar with, it looks to be like a Salafi edition, and I believe there is like either footnotes or a sharh from Sheikh Fawzan. So that's definitely like a red alert, we don't know. We can't rely on these people to give us the authentic Mathab. We can only rely on them to confuse us. So I would definitely disregard that version of the book that's in translation. And if you have the other version, Sheikh Musa's translation, then please, just refer to what we've said here. I ask Allah to increase us in knowledge and to send His mercy upon our ummah that is suffering many trials and tribulations. We ask Allah for knowledge, and we ask Allah for success in the dunya and the akhirah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.